Welcome, everyone. This is a public lecture. We're working now to adapt to a really hybrid style. So as you can see, we have an audience here in the Dean's Conference Room at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego, as well as an online audience. I'm Barry Naughton. I'm the So Kwan Luk Professor of Chinese and International Affairs here at GPS at UC San Diego. And I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest today, Roselyn Hsueh, who is the Professor of Political Economy at Temple University. And we're very, very happy that Roselyn's here to speak about her new book, which is extremely interesting and comes out formally, I guess, next month?
Next month, yeah.
Next month. So you can't quite buy it yet, but I think after this talk, you'll want to go to Amazon and click on it and pre-order it so you can get it right away. Roselyn is Associate Professor of Political Science. I said political economy, but it should be political science. Although you're not going to object to being a political economist, I don't think. And her first book, China's Regulatory State, attracted a lot of attention. Now she's expanded her purview to some very interesting observations that take in Russia and India as well as China for this new book, which is called Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization in China, India, and Russia. Roselyn earned her BA and her PhD from UC Berkeley, and we're delighted to have her here today. Roselyn, so thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me here to the 21st Century China Center here at UC San Diego in the Global Policy School. And I just want to thank Executive Director Lei Guang and Harris Dorsey here, and also Professor Victor Shi for helping to arrange my talk here today. And thank you also very much to Professor Barry Naughton for the kind introductions. And it's just such an honor to be sitting here next to the preeminent political economist of China. So thank you very much for having me here. I think we're trying to get the PowerPoint presentation. Great, perfect. Let me see if I can move this. Great. So the book, Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization in China, India, and Russia will indeed come out next month. It is available, as Professor Naughton had mentioned, on Amazon and Cambridge right now. And I actually have a special code for 20% off paperback or hardcover, whichever way you want for your library. And I will share that at the end of the presentation. So thank you. Here I have, just want to go to the next slide as I start. Okay, let's see. Or maybe I should do this.
Sure, this way, sorry.
Okay, perfect. I should use the.
However you like.
Okay.
A couple should work.
Okay. Great. So as Professor Barry Naughton mentioned, my first book, China's Regulatory State. The second book built on it, and then now brings it to also understanding state market relations and institutional foundations of capitalism in India and Russia. I want to speak a little bit about, or at least point out to you the cover of this second book. This is actually of the technical textiles process in power loom in Gujarat, India. And the reason I chose, can't cover all industries or all countries. And the reason I chose this particular cover is because I look seriously at sectors, and I look at sectoral structures and organization of institutions, and how those factors play an important role in understanding what I call sectoral pathways to globalization. And so the India technical textile sectors will come back in the presentation, but I just want to explain a little bit about the cover. So I begin with just kind of sharing some motivations for this study. So there's this assumption in academic political science, but really also in kind of contemporary policy analysis in that there's a model to explain transition economies in the context of global economic integration, by which I'm talking about, the age of neoliberalism and the idea of introduction of market competition and market reform. And the assumption is that also there are national level linear unitary globalization trajectories that we're all converging into a neoliberal model, a kind of more liberal economic set of policies, particularly as countries become members of the World Trade Organization, enter the international economy. And so, building on my previous book on China's regulatory state, where I actually argue that China's regulatory state is not the regulatory state that we imagine it to be, as we all know now. In some ways, hindsight is 2020. My first book, published in 2011, pointed out very early on that this is actually a very different regulatory model. What is interesting is that China is using regulation to achieve state imperatives. And so, building on that previous book, I explored the analytical utility of taking the study cross-regionally, now to other regional powers and regional economies that are quite important in the global economy, take it to the sector and the subsector. And by doing so, I'm able to uncover a new model of globalization. As the title tells us, I compare it to China, India, and Russia. And I do so, in some ways, I'm able to control for some things, right? These are regional powers of comparable size. I'm able to control for similar timing of globalization. At around 1990, we have, after Tiananmen Square, Deng Xiaoping taking the southern tour and opening up the eastern coastal part of the country to the global economy. We have in 1990, 91, big bang globalization in India. And then also, as we all know, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which in conventional wisdom tells us introduced massive privatization and introduction of competition and macro level liberalization. So similar timing in globalization, so I'm able to control for that. And then I also examine in these countries, I control for two sets of kind of large industries with subsectors in them. I look at labor-intensive industries, which traditionally textiles is considered more of a traditional older industry. And then I look at the capital-intensive, more value-added industry, telecommunications. Now, as we all know, there are lots of complexity even within these labor-intensive and capital-intensive industries, which I will come to in a little bit. But I'm able to control for some of, for in terms of analytical and systematic analysis purposes, I choose these countries. Globalizing countries that traditionally, right, they also had kind of more socialist policies. Even India had held on to socialist policies under Nehru, and then into the 80s, and then in the 90s we saw difference. Existing industrial bases. I'm not comparing China to a country that really was starting from scratch, not a late developer. These are all three countries that had existing industrial bases. In my work, when I trace to industrial origins, I'm able to look at the beginnings of mechanized textiles in the late 1800s, and then also the beginning of kind of the first introduction of telecommunications infrastructure in the turn of the last century. And so they have existing industrial bases. So I'm in many ways comparing there are many differences, but in some ways they are quite similar. So I'm able to control for some of those differences to make the arguments that I do. I'm going to go over this kind of really quickly, but just, making a nod to say that there are existing work in political science, academic literature that where, China specialists have claimed that, China could contribute to building theory and in comparative politics, could building generalizable potentialities in work, even as we find case-specific findings. There have been other scholars who kind of done this kind of cross-regional work. And even to say that actually looking at cross-regional comparisons is quite important because it offers potentially grounded explanations, then allowing us to establish generalizabilities, but also scope conditions. There's a robust literature in sectoral analysis, and then also at the intersection of IR and comparative that motivates my strategic value framework, which I'm going to introduce in a little bit. So these are just some of the motivations behind this. Let's start with a research puzzle, which I've kind of alluded to already. We have these countries liberalizing on a macro level their economies. They joined WTO in the 1990s and beyond. They appear to have departed from kind of these two iconic models in existing literature about development. They departed from the East Asian developmental state, right? Famously, the East Asian tigers. And I claim that they departed from that model in that in the East Asian mix integration into the international economy during the Cold War, when they had access to American and European markets. And it was during a time of kind of the West versus the communist countries. It was a time where they had access to markets, so they were able to restrict foreign direct investment to protect domestic sector. We have these countries now under study that under the age of neoliberalism have very much liberalized. At the same time, though, these countries differed from the historical Latin America model, kind of, that had more liberal foreign direct investment policies around the same time the East Asian mix integrated into the international economy. But what was different was that because they were so open to foreign direct investment, they were historically known to have been exploited by coalitions of FDI and local interests. But these countries are different from the East Asian developmental states in that they are much more open to foreign direct investment. At the same time, they differ from Latin America in that we have actually seen industrial trajectories where there have been technological development and a much more astute regulation of foreign direct investment. And so here I just have some data to show you that in 1980, and Russia's not even on here because it was still the Soviet Union, but these countries were very, at the time of 1980, before that macro liberalization, quite close to FDI here as a percentage of GDP, even compared to some of the East Asian mix. By 2005, they were much more open to foreign direct investment as as a percentage of GDP, exceeding United States around at par. Brazil, a country that was known to be very open to foreign direct investment. So by this time, we have Russia in the data. And by 2015, we have these three countries being kind of among some of the more open economies of the world. And then, of course, famously, China is one of the top by kind of in terms of inflows of FDI, number two, after the United States, maybe even have exceeded the United States in terms of receiving foreign direct investment. Here it's just a cross-time data to show you FDI as a percentage of GDP for all three countries, in some ways converging in terms of their openness vis-a-vis the rest of the economy to foreign direct investment. And another measure of globalization is exports of goods and services. Here as a percentage of GDP, kind of very similar as well. So these countries are in some ways comparable, yet they have re-regulated very differently. And how do we make sense of that re-regulation? Is what I'm going to look at here. And they have re-regulated, leading to distinct development outcomes. All the same, though, in terms of the distinct development outcomes, the conventional wisdom is what we probably all know. China just far, out competes everyone in terms of science and technology patents here, one measure of advancement, right? Technological investment. China outpaces everyone. Yet when we open the black box in some ways of science and technology patents and look at the micro sectoral level, we do see some variation, not just across sectors, but across the countries. Here, I'm just taking one of the sectors that I study, telecoms and ICT. Here we're comparing, some cross-time data of patents in ICT. And here we have Russia ICT kind of outpacing the other two countries. But then there's differences even between Russia ICT and Russia telecoms. So value-added services and versus telecoms infrastructure. It's kind of interesting, right? Difference and variation, not just across and within, not just within these countries, but also across these countries in ways that depart from dominant perspectives of China outpacing all the other countries, not just these two, but everywhere else. And then also conventional wisdom of, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, kind of, Russia being kind of in some ways a basket case of development, and similar for India as well. So what is a relationship between internal development and integration into the global economy? How and why do state market relations differ? And do these differences matter for post-Cold War era global conflict and cooperation? This third piece, I'm happy to answer during Q&A, but I will focus on the first two. And so I'm gonna front load some of the arguments of the book. I argue that market governance structures will mediate that relationship between globalization and development outcomes, right? Those two puzzles that I already pointed out, much more open than the rest of the world and compared to other past models, yet differences in development within, across sectors within these countries and across each other, and also from the other dominant models. And I'm gonna argue that my strategic value framework will help us understand and demystify the cross-national and within country sectoral differences. I theorize that perceived strategic value of sector interacting with sectoral structures and organization of institutions. And by this, we're talking about stuff like telecoms is going to be telecoms in any country, right? There are going to be technological properties and structures that are going to be continuous and in any country. And so sectoral structures and organization of institutions will matter. But the perceived strategic value of these sectors as countries and state elites respond to internal pressures will shape national and within country sectoral patterns. And the resulting, what I call the national configurations of sectoral models, will be the micro-institutional foundations of capitalism. And that will have impact for development outcomes and also global conflict and cooperation. And some of, make the tech wars and the trade wars that we are seeing today, my strategic value model will shed light on. And also kind of the more case specific findings is that in China, the strategic value model allows us to identify techno security developmentalism as a strategic value orientation that will shape what I call bifurcated capitalism, which centralizes the governance of high-tech dual use sectors. By dual use, I mean, sectors that have defense sector applications as well as commercial applications, and will decentralize the more labor-intensive and less value-added sectors. The strategic value framework helps us identify neoliberal self-reliance as the strategic value orientation, shaping what I call bifurcated liberalism, which centralizes the governance of small-scale rural sectors and decentralizes high-tech, globally connected sectors. The strategic value framework helps us identify in Russia security resource nationalism, which will shape bifurcated oligarchy, which is why today we see centralized governance in infrastructure and resource sectors and decentralization in the more labor-intensive and less value-added sectors. So here I'm front-loading some of the arguments, and I will show you a case-specific data to prove my arguments. As I move forward in the presentation. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about research design and methods. I'm going to tell you my conceptualization of market governance, what allows me to then systematically map out these market governance patterns that I mentioned and the strategic value orientation. And I will go into some detail about how do I even measure and define strategic value for these countries. And what are some sectoral characteristics that we need to be aware of and that have impact? And then evidence for countries and sectors. So this is a very fieldwork heavy research. I have a comparative case research design that allows me at different levels of analysis, process trace my argument. So I process trace from sectoral origins, and then also I look I have case studies from 1980 to 2020. I look at countries, industry, subsector, and company. My company case studies allow me to provide evidence for my sectoral level arguments. So I have company case studies that show me that actually, in fact, we do see these sectoral level patterns in these countries. I interviewed different stakeholders from key government, industry, company, and civil society stakeholders, business associations, sector associations, foreign delegations, government at different levels, right? I talked to state council level officials to sector associations. I talked to different types of sector associations, right? As we know, and many here, because you are China specialists, you know that's not all sector associations are made equal in China, right? The Textiles Association, Sector Association, is very different from the Cellular Industry Association that is much more government regulated. So I talked to different types of civil society stakeholders across industries in China, in India, and Russia. This is based on published and unpublished documentary evidence, descriptive statistics that I gather from national governments, businesses, associations, foreign delegations, IOs, and then also companies. Okay, so here just kind of a picture of fieldwork. This is, a bookstore in Russia and right outside of Red Square in Moscow. We have a picture of a set of books in a bookstore in Wangfujing in Beijing. And then actually very recently here we have in central Delhi, an exhibit on state building in Brazil. And so what I am showing in these pictures is that these countries are also interested in each other. And they're also interested in what motivates how these governments work, right? Is it Xi Jinping here? Is it, Gandhi? And here, of course, we have a picture of the Liberty Bell and, being from Philadelphia. I actually used to live kitty corner from the Liberty Bell and state building in Brazil. So I argue actually the strategic value framework could even help us understand other countries and sectors and including state building in Brazil. Okay, so how do I conceptualize market governance? And I think for China scholars here, this makes a lot of sense. We need to look at two dimensions. We need to look at the level and scope of the state and market coordination, but we also need to look at property rights arrangements. But we can't only look at one of these dimensions because the reality is in the global economic integration of these countries in the age of neoliberalism, there's a lot of complex interdependence, as they say in IR, right? We have, state-owned enterprises that actually the state doesn't really coordinate all that much in terms of property rights arrangements, in terms of business scope and investment level. But then we also have private industry in China today, for example, where they experience high level of state intervention and high level of regulation, strict regulations on property rights arrangements, market entry, business scope. So we have to look at both dimensions. Just because they're state-owned enterprises, like in India, for example, that doesn't mean that the government is necessarily all that involved in market governance. So we need to look at both dimensions. And what I do is by looking at both dimensions, I'm able to come up with a conceptual map and a taxonomy of market governance. And so I briefly talked about it. I'm happy to explain more about each of the different dimensions, but looking at market coordination, I'm able to identify at the central level, or is it decentralized or mixed government authorities that are coordinating markets? Is it a bureaucracy, a regulator, or government sponsored or non-government body? In terms of distribution of property rights arrangements, what are the controlling interests? Is it a government or private stakeholder or mixed ownership? Or this idea in China, state-sponsored private organizations or state-controlled private organizations, or state-owned enterprises that are pretty much, town and village enterprises are, in name only a state-owned enterprise. And so then I come up with this typology of market governance that then allows me to then map two different industrial sectors in these huge, large, complex economies: centralized governance, regulated governance, decentralized governance, and private governance. And so I make the argument that in these economies, you see a combination of these different things. But how do we make sense of the combination of these different types of governances that I map out to sectors? Well, the strategic value orientation of these sectors will help us explain and understand why we see centralized governance in telecommunications in China. But decentralized and private governance in labor-intensive, less value-added, capital-intensive sectors that very much coexist in the same economy, and whereby subnational governments are the key authorities of implementation and also management of market entry, business scope, and investment level. But then in the same economy, a much more centralized picture in other sectors. And this is true not just in China, but in other economies, in my cases. I want to make a nod that in the age of neoliberalism, there are other forces of change. And in fact, these are dominant debates that are going on, raging debates in political science and economics and sociology and so forth. Open economy politics. When you open the economy, you're going to have sectoral interests. Subnational characteristics, which I've alluded to already, historical legacies. And then we also have scholars who say that, well, historical legacies of subnational governance, right? Regime type, right? The big elephant in the room. Wait a second. We have India, that's a democracy. We have China, that is an authoritarian country. Russia, that's increasingly authoritarian, but for a while, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, typed as a semi-authoritarian regime. And so what, and of course, global norms, the fact that these countries are in the WTO. India is a founding member of the WTO. These things do matter. And so I call them common forces of change. Yet, despite these common forces of change, we see sectors being governed very differently. How do we explain that? Yes. Yes,
go
please.
back to the 2x2.
Oh, yes, yeah, happy to talk about the governance.
Yeah. And these are sectoral specific. For example, because the way that you mapped out this, as if these are national economic, political economic arrangements. But in other words, market governance is it sector specific?
Market
is a national level.
Yeah, so in my findings, I find that the way I think about the two different dimensions of market governance allows me to map across sectors. So I'm able to map across sectors these different types of market governance. Now, in terms of scope conditions, I will have to say that there are going to be smaller economies and smaller countries whereby certain sectors might dominate, and so then you might see some of the kind of more dominant types of governance structures in certain economies. But in the age of complex interdependence, we do see a lot of economies that are quite mixed and also different. And you have seen different governments attempt to develop certain industries. But these are in my research findings, I'm able to map it to different sectors. So where market governance is a mediation between globalization and development outcomes in these industries. So common forces of change. I introduced a strategic value framework that allow me to bridge kind of more materialist arguments, more economic conditions that are objective, with more of a constructivist, historical institutionalist explanation about intersubjectivity of state elites as they respond to internal and external pressures to think about the value of sectors. Some sectors, like in the capital-intensive, more value-added sectors, will have higher contribution to national technology, to the national technology base, higher contribution to national security contributions and applications and so forth. And so there are going to be different strategic value orientations. And I argue that then they will map out to these patterns of market governance. So, so the idea is perceived strategic value sectors as state elites respond to economic and political pressures will have impact on the dominant sectoral patterns of market governance. But governance details will be influenced by sectoral structures and organization of institutions. And this is so because sectoral structures are going to be important. They are going to be constant across countries. And there are also going to be nation-specific organization of institutions. How sectors are organized in particular countries will have influence over time. Well, how do we define strategic value? I look at political and economic dimensions, right? How sectors are perceived to be important to the social and political stability of countries, into external security and geopolitical issues. But economic dimension is important, right? Famously, the developmental state model says how sectors are, how they contribute to the national technology base will be important with how, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, regulated foreign direct investment, right? So the economic dimension continues to be very important, and they're going to factor into how countries think about the strategic value of sectors as they respond to the more open economy context. And that will shape how states formulate goals and methods. Who controls the industrial policy? What kind of measures are employed? But how state elites define, make claims upon, and think about economic political pressures will be intersubjective. And there will be historical ideas that come into fore. And so I'm here, basically, I have hypotheses I'm going to skip, but essentially the higher the perceived strategic value of a sector, the more likely the state will enhance its control and centralize bureaucratic coordination and regulate market entry and business scope and vice versa. Now, you could say that, well, shouldn't telecoms just be considered strategic for all countries? And so all countries will just regulate telecommunications with centralized control, bureaucratic coordination, and regulated market entry and business scope. Well, what's really interesting is when we apply the strategic value framework across countries, India and Russia, we see that that's actually not quite true. How India thinks about the strategic value of sectors operate very differently, and what is important and what is considered important to India operates very differently from China and Russia. And I'm going to show you evidence for that. And sectoral structures, just a quick nod about some of the structures are important. Technological properties, the core competencies of sectors, type of commodity chain, domestic sector competitiveness, position, the uses and purposes of services and products, existing kind of organization of institutions. These are all going to be important to shaping how government goals are actually implemented and what kind of measures are employed. So indeed, there will be more government mobilization of investment in telecoms, whether you are in India or in China. But how then telecoms is viewed by these nations will shape whether in fact the state will intervene in market coordination and distribution of property rights arrangements. And so here, what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to map out to you the interaction of the strategic value and sectoral attributes. We have in China, sectors have applications to national security, contribution to the national technology base that are going to be in service of what? Political and social stability, party legitimacy. Those are going to be the sectors as China responds to kind of internal and external insecurities of, domestic political consolidation for political stability for the Chinese Communist Party, as they respond to Tiananmen Square incident, as they respond to the impacts of financial crises on the economy. Those, as elite decision makers respond to these internal and external pressures, they are going to then govern these different sectors that have different orientations for the state government very differently. And so we have in labor-intensive, less value-added sectors, such as textiles, where the government has completely let go. And this is true, since the 1980s. But in telecoms, this is not true. If you, when I do in my work, when I trace industrial trajectories, what we're seeing today under Xi Jinping since 2013, in fact, actually began decades earlier. The Chinese government never let go of telecommunications infrastructure. the Chinese government introduced competition, which is why we see vibrant competition in among the telecom operators that are owned by the state, but never let go of important infrastructure that allows the government to control information dissemination. But value-added service providers that operate on top of that infrastructure, right? Here, the sectoral structures matter. The value-added service providers, FDI, private capital, for many decades. Very recently, very famously, there has been re-regulation, right? We see private value-added service providers like Alibaba, the Ant Group, and some of the platform industry enterprises experiencing re-regulation. But now that these industries have developed, China has developed the industrial base, but political consolidation for the Chinese Communist Party has now become important. And so as they respond to internal pressures, they are now re-regulating in even a sector that already was centralized, right, by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. A subsector like value-added services that the Chinese government has been very open to is now being re-regulated. And so what I'm going to do is, because we're in the Chinese, I will talk, anyone with kind of more questions about the India and Russia cases, we could talk more in the Q&A. But in Russia, what we see is that strategic are rural small-scale industry sectors. These are sectors that were associated with the independence movement and kind of values of nationalism, India's nationalist imagination about the importance of rural sectors vis-a-vis British colonialism. And so some of those values have over time continued to influence Big Bang globalization. So the conventional wisdom is that in 1990, India opened the economy to global economy, to foreign direct investment. And that is true in many sectors, including telecoms, which China has held on to. But there are sectors and subsectors in India where the Indian government continues to protect or have exemptions, actually very quite nuanced, project level and sector level exemptions and protections because of their importance for the nationalist imagination that actually does continue to mobilize voters, continue to mobilize to politicians who are mobilizing their constituents. And so as a result, you have almost the opposite picture in India, where telecoms is actually really open, and textiles, one of the only ministries of textiles that exists today in today's neoliberalism is a ministry of textiles in India. And in Russia, and actually what I'm going to do here, I have a map here, a conceptual map of where the subsectors map out to the different patterns of governance. And this is in my book. So a plug for buying the book. You will see how the strategic value, sectoral structures, and market governance gets mapped out. But I want to show you some photos of kind of the evidence. We have techno security developmentalism, right? Very decentralized, deregulated in textiles, but in telecoms, centralized governance, super ministry, state-owned infrastructure, private foreign stakeholders, and value added. It's both FDI and import substitution, a combination. But this argument travels to the subsector. We have technical textiles, right? More value added, more capital intensive, has more contributions to national security, to China's ambitions of going to space, to we have defense applications. That's where you're going to see the Ministry of Science and Technology subsidizing private companies in technical textiles. You're going to see more import industrialization, substitution policies. But on the other hand, apparel and clothing, one of the most open sectors in China. You have data here to show you that private enterprises, rule the day. Subnational governments rule the day in these labor-intensive, value-added sectors. In India, we have today, Modi needs to even, kind of pick a nod to Gandhi Swadeshism, but lots of competition in telecommunications. Now, as countries respond to external pressures such as the disputes between China and India on the borders. Most recently, the advent of Chinese competition in telecoms equipment, we saw the re-regulation, right? We saw India being very, very open to foreign direct investment except to Pakistan. And now they've identified China as, a Chinese FDI coming into India needs to be approved by the highest level of government. But that wasn't true in these dominant patterns for decades until very recently. So yes, internal and external pressures across time, there are going to be incremental evolution of strategic value orientation. But when you trace across time in these sectors, you see these dominant patterns. So a regulator in telecommunications, but then you have a textiles ministry in textiles. And there are going to be effects on development outcomes. Because of these protections, we have even technical textiles in India where, it's more capital intensive, but because of past dependencies, technical textiles in India today is small scale industry, highly pollutant, and in some ways crippled by these exemptions and protections for textiles, to a point where large mechanized textile mills actually invest in handlooms and power looms. And so the past dependency for development outcomes here in these dominant patterns is that it actually keeps Indian textiles more handicraft, more niche markets, rather than more advanced materials and more advanced kind of defense-oriented technical textiles. In Russia, we have textiles being one of the first sectors to be deregulated after, actually even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So because it didn't have much defense orientation, or was not considered to be connected to military applications whatsoever. So Gorbachev actually introduced competition in textiles very early on. But contrary to conventional wisdom in telecommunications, was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia actually never privatized telecoms infrastructure. It was decentralized to the regions. But because Russia never privatized telecommunications infrastructure, when Putin came into power in the last 2 decades, the government was able to centralize, I have a map here, of telecommunications infrastructure into one state-owned enterprise. And so now the Russian Federation has complete control of telecommunications infrastructure under Russell Telecoms. And that enables the Russian government to control telecommunications and information dissemination, even though operating on top of it are value-added service providers that have been greatly privatized. Now, external responses to internal external pressures matter. And I'm going to conclude here to just give a nod to how in the post-Crimea era, we have a textiles industry that was completely languishing, not really developed. Even FDI did not want to go into that part of the economy. We have Putin and regional oligarchs, advocating for import and substitution policies in response to sanctions. And those sanctions were actually quite nuanced and quite targeted. Didn't really even hit the labor-intensive, less value-added sectors. Yet, in response to they were able to mobilize forces within Russia to support import and substitution policies, even in a sector that was largely deregulated and decentralized. And so that would be an example where strategic value orientation really mattered for the sectoral variations of governance. Now, mainly though in the technical sectors that have defense orientation. And so this idea of, sectors that contribute to the national technology base and national security still, rings true in that ISI policies mainly are focused on those sectors, not the more labor intensive ones. So to conclude, This to say that globalization pathways vary by country and sectors within country with these interacting strategic value and sectoral logics. And that firm level behavior is going to be shaped by the value bounded rationality and institutions of market governance. And they are going to have path dependent effects. So we're going to see, resulting these varieties of capitalism that are going to be in existence, whether we are seeing globalization or the deglobalization that we have been seeing of late. And so I will end here and be open to Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I'll moderate the next 15 minutes of Q&A. I've got the Zoom open in front of me on my laptop. So if you can, those at the remote audience, if you post a question in the question box, I'll try and pass it on to Roselyn right here, as well as inviting people who are in the room with me. I want to start out and ask the first question, and that is, Roselyn, in a way, you've told us that the perception of a common trend of globalization, that many people had a tendency towards convergence, that looking at the micro foundations, you already could see that this was not what it appeared to be. It was not a kind of broad convergence pattern. Now that we're going the other direction and that we seem to be moving towards deglobalization, what does your framework predict for the way this process will develop?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Naughton, for those questions. My framework would predict that even in deglobalization, we're going to see sectoral patterns. And we're going to see sectoral patterns that will orient around these kind of strategic value orientations, right? So value bounded kind of rationality about the importance of sectors will continue to shape the patterns, even within what we're seeing today, a global pattern, the dominant global pattern of deglobalization, these sectoral patterns will hold. And so there will be continued more decentralized and deregulated or subnational governance in textiles, for example, in China, and also other labor intensive, less value added sectors. But just like before, even in the age of globalization, when I argued there wasn't really even that convergence, we are going to see continued centralization and in the more strategic sectors in China. And so in the framework is that there will be continuity. Now, I do think that there will be kind of periodic episodes of intervention and also deregulation that will be in responsive to kind of internal and external pressures that come along, but the dominant patterns will hold.
On the other hand, I mean, if we look at, just to take your sectors,
yes.
It seems like every country separately is seeing more security implications in, for example, telecom.
Yeah.
So weirdly, although we're deglobalizing, in some ways we're becoming more similar. Right. India now has many more constraints on Chinese participation in the telecom system. So is that a new convergence, or do you think that's just a happenstance, unusual occurrence?
I think there's a lot of political mobilization about thinking about Chinese capital in India in a way that has a strategic dimension as well as an economic dimension, right? I mentioned, security issues because of the border disputes, but the economic dimension was that increasingly in the equipment sectors, China was becoming dominant, and so the re-regulation that's happening in telecoms really in many ways is targeted towards China, but not other countries or other even equipment makers or other value-added service providers from other places. And so in that sense, it's really in response to what is happening today, right? The increasing dominance of China on the economic dimension, but also the security dimension. Now, once this, potentially, right, if the security disputes are resolved, if that does happen, we may see some scaling back in India, maybe towards FDI, or towards FDI in certain sectors, towards Chinese FDI in certain sectors. So there could be changes there, depending on some of the issues that are going on. And of course, we hope that, for example, that that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will not last forever, and somehow we may see peace. And so when we see potentially those changes, then some of the re-regulation that we're seeing in the technical sectors of even more value added, more labor intensive, less capital intensive value added sectors, that may also change. So some of it may be a bit phenomenon in that sense.
And in a way, I mean, maybe I'm being Pollyannish, but in a way I take some comfort from your framework suggesting that even as we deglobalize in certain sectors like telecom, that other sectors we're not likely to see that kind of spillover, and therefore maybe there's a new way to learn to coexist in a more conflictual world. Lei, did you have
I have maybe I have two questions. Maybe the one that I follow up on Barry's question in some way, that is, if you just look at the sectors,
Yes.
okay, telecom, textile, maybe, and forget about the nations. Some sectors are incredibly globalized. The business people, investors in the country, in India, has to face, in the textile sector, has to face global competition. But in other sectors, investors in India, we don't. Right? Now, how? In other words, it's not so much that one sector is strategically more important to the national leaders, so they evolve a different kind of a market governance structure, but rather the way that that sector is connected to the global market, that determines how the market governance structure evolves. I mean, I thought Peter Kazenstein's work, for example, small states in world markets, right?
Yeah.
But of course, you're not describing about small states. Actually, that's a question from me too. That is, if you're not comparing China, India, and Russia, but a bunch of small states, Singapore, maybe Taiwan, just Taiwan and Ukraine. Would they be able to sort of, with your framework, strategic values framework, apply in explaining how their sectoral pathways to globalization?
Yeah.
So that's just a jumbled a little bit, but it's really how these different sectors connect to the global market and introduces external factors that impacted the evolution of the market governance institutions.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions, and they're very important ones. So in terms of the framework, a very important reason for the interaction, right, between strategic value and sectoral logics is that, yes, we do need to look at kind of sectoral structures. And one of the sectoral structures for, in the age of complex interdependence is position of national sectors in the global economy, and then also even position in the global value chain, right, in the supply networks. And so do need to seriously take that into account, and they do have effects on my framework in terms of the actual mechanisms of governance. And the reason I don't, it's an interaction, and that the strategic value orientation is still important because, as you point out in the India case, it is in fact true that India is exposed to the global market in textiles, but what is really interesting and really a puzzle for me in the very beginning is, in fact, actually, India had been very close, unlike China, which allowed FDI to come in and help build, factories, right? China became the global factory of the world in apparel, right? India, on the other hand, really kept the textiles market very close, both in manufacturing and in services.
Yes, that may not be because of strategic value, but also certain kind of democratic sort of Gandhian culture that the rural voters has always been very important to Indian politicians, and Gandhi, despite the fact that he was assassinated and got a lot of people forgotten, and he still holds a lot of weight in the rural politics in India.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, when I was in India, I was struck by that too. That is, I came from Beijing, and overnight they canceled all the yellow cabs because of low efficiency and pollution. And they go to India, they have this 1970s ambassador car still sputtering, and nobody can do anything about it.
Yeah.
And all the shops were like small, and it's just politics. It's a democratic politics. The politicians could not do anything about it. It's more kind of national political culture rather than the strategic value that explains why the persistence.
Yeah, and so by one of the reasons why I trace from sectoral origins, and I really go back. I mean, in the book, it's organized the 3 main chapters for each country, and one of the main chapters is tracing back to the sectoral origins. And the reason I do that is because I look at the beginnings of mechanized textiles in India, and then so you look at what the path dependency, right? It's a kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? What came first, right? Is it the strategic value, or is it the democratic governance, right? First, and then so when Gandhi was mobilizing for independence, there were a lot of kind of rural industry, lots of small scale producers, but really at that time he was also able to mobilize with even large scale textiles. And in fact, mechanized textile mills were their part of the kind of National Party Congress, and kind of the catch-all party-ness of the National Party Congress was the fact that Gandhi was able to bring together, these rural constituents, and then even the national industry as well. And so from the very beginning of mechanized textiles, we saw the nationalist imagination being quite important. And then once India becomes independent and becomes a democracy, right? No more, not part of the British colonial government, then yeah, there's a path dependent effects of that nationalist imagination. And those path dependent effects continue to influence electoral politics. So that photo of Modi really still need to reenact, of Gandhi, right, with spinning, cotton spinning, and so forth. And it has affected other sectors that are rural and small scale, and that's why in services, a lot of those sectors were very closed despite Big Bang liberalization. That famously, even among analysts of India, the conventional wisdom is like, India is quite open. But when you disaggregate the macroeconomy and go to the sectoral level, then you begin to see that, in fact, actually, that's not true. And there are path-dependent effects too, to not just on the electoral level, but to these kind of dominant patterns. Why is it that India apparel textiles, even as they are in the global markets, why is it that they specialize in some of the niche markets in terms of specialized textiles, and why India continues to have really a huge global market, really in what handlooms and power looms could produce. And so those are kind of the implications for development.
We've got just time for one last question, 1 or 2. Maybe let's take 2 and then ask you to make a very quick response. Go ahead.
Yes, and I'm happy to stick around and answer questions.
Okay, so thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question actually follows this question.
Yes.
I see that you mentioned there is a sectoral difference. Does this sectoral difference stem from the fact that the market structure of the 2 industries is actually different? So for the telecommunication market is a oligopoly market, in which you don't really have a optimal results. You do really need to have some government intervention from the very beginning.
Yes.
And for the textile industry, which in most of the cases is more competitive, so you don't really have a lot of need to have a government intervention. And so if this is the case, so there's already an economic logic of government control. It can be the case of subsidy, it can also be the case of state ownership, On the other hand, you were also mentioning perceive the strategic value.
Yeah.
So will this strategic value intensify or weakens the government control, the state? So what is your so that's my reaction.
Yes, yes,
So what's
yeah.
your reaction to
Yeah,
this?
yeah.
Kind of thing?
Thank you so much. Yeah, you're certainly right. The technological properties and also kind of the organization of certain sectors are particularly kind of in, network sectors tend to be of kind of a certain structure already. So maybe that's driving some of the dominant, patterns of market governance. But what's really interesting is that when you then look at, when you go to the country and you look at the context, in fact, that would be what you would assume to be true, but then you see deregulation and you see the decentralization in India telecoms, for example. And
that depends on the state's different countries' perception of the strategic value.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where you're exactly right. And that's why you see the interaction effects, right? And I'm not saying that sectoral structures don't matter. Sectoral characteristics and attributes certainly matter. And I advocate for bringing the sector in, right? We really need to bring the sector back in. But at the same time, then we see kind of these puzzles on why empirically that's in fact not true. Why in certain sectors, the country continued to centralize and re-regulate, as they respond to internal and external pressures. And so that interaction is very important. And so I hope that answers your question.
A great place to end, I think. And of course, the people with premium seats who are here live with us will be able to continue speaking with Roselyn Hsueh after we end this Zoom event. But we do have to wrap up the Zoom event, and we're doing so with a brief screen of upcoming events. We've got a lot of very interesting things happening. So please stay tuned, get on our email distribution list. A couple of great events coming up in April and the beginning of May, including, I think it's unfair to single out one, but our colleague Victor Shi has written a tremendous book about our relations in China during mostly in the Maoist period, but extending into the post-Maoist period. It's a great book, and he's going to introduce it to us on May 5th.
I'm very excited about that, and I'm going to be logging in.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll end the Zoom meeting right now.
Thank you so much.